Hello everyone. Today I will tell you 10 facts about World War II, which you didn't know before. Get some snack and let's hop in.
Number 1. The US had a plan to invade Canada and Britain before World War II. The US developed War Plan Red, which detailed a potential war against Britain and an invasion of Canada. Though it was never acted upon, it showed how global alliances could have played out differently. At the time, Britain was still one of the world's most powerful empires and controlled vast territories, including Canada, Australia, India, and large portions of Africa. Even though the US and Britain were not at war, relations between the two countries had a history of tension. The US and Britain had fought in the War of 1812 when Britain invaded the US from Canada. There were ongoing disputes over naval power and trade influence. The British Empire controlled key global trade routes, which could pose an economic threat to the US. The plan included how US would defeat Britain by these steps. Invading Canada quickly, the plan called for a swift invasion of Canada before Britain could send reinforcements. The US would target Halifax, Nova Scotia, a key British naval base, Montreal and Quebec City to cut off eastern Canada, Toronto and Winnipeg to disrupt Canada's transportation and communication, Vancouver to block British influence in the Pacific. The very next steps were destroying British naval bases. The US planned to bomb and blockade British bases in the Caribbean like Bermuda and Jamaica, to stop British reinforcements from reaching North America. Building secret airfields for bombing raids, the US even built airstrips disguised as civilian airports along the US-Canada border, ready to launch bombing missions into Canadian territory if needed. And finally, last step of the War Plan Red is preparing for a British naval blockade. The US assumed that Britain, with its powerful navy, would try to blockade American ports. The plan included stockpiling resources and preparing for economic warfare. Luckily, the plan was never used to historical events in Europe, but while War Plan Red was only a hypothetical plan, it was detailed enough that the US government allocated money for military infrastructure in preparation for it. Some historians believe that if world events had gone differently, for example, if the US had sided with Germany in World War II, this plan could have actually been used. It's strange to think that the US once planned to go to war with its closest ally today. Second fact about World War II is that almost nobody knows that Hitler's nephew fought for the US Navy. William Patrick Hitler was Adolf Hitler's nephew, born in 1911 in Liverpool, England, to Adolf Hitler's half-brother Alois Hitler Jr. and his English wife Frances. William Patrick's connection to Adolf Hitler made his life highly controversial, especially during World War II. William himself decided to fight for the US. And why did he decide to do that? William's decision to fight for the United States during World War II is tied to his complicated relationship with his uncle and his desire to escape the looming shadow of Nazism. Here's a deeper look at his motivations and the circumstances surrounding his decision. First one is escape from Nazi Germany. In 1939, William Patrick Hitler moved to Germany with his mother. He had initially attempted to get a job within the Nazi regime, partly because of his famous last name. However, he quickly found that his status as Hitler's nephew was more of a curse than a blessing. He wasn't embraced by the Nazi elite, and he was even dismissed by Hitler himself. He felt increasingly disillusioned with the Nazi regime and became resentful of his uncle. He even sought to extract financial support from the Nazi regime, but after a failed attempt to extract money from Hitler, he became frustrated with his connection to the Nazis. In 1939, William Patrick decided to emigrate to the US, largely because he was disillusioned with the Nazi regime and his strained relationship with his uncle. He had been a vocal critic of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, which only worsened his situation in Germany. When he arrived in the US, he changed his name to William Patrick Stewart Houston to distance himself from his infamous uncle and began working to make a life for himself outside of the Nazi spotlight. After the US entered World War II, William Patrick Hitler felt compelled to serve in the military, like many other citizens who wanted to fight against the Axis powers. His decision was also partly driven by a desire to stand in direct opposition to his infamous uncle's regime. He enlisted in the US Navy in 1944, changing his name to William Patrick Stewart Houston. This was a symbolic act of severing his ties to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi ideology. His time in the US Navy was relatively unremarkable, as he served mostly in administrative positions. However, his decision to fight for the US military, given his familial ties to Hitler, became a symbolic act of defiance against the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. After the war, William Patrick Hitler lived a fairly quiet life in the US. He changed his name again to avoid the negative publicity associated with being the nephew of Adolf Hitler. He eventually married and had children, but kept a low profile for the rest of his life. He never sought the limelight and rarely spoke about his uncle or his own wartime service. The third one is a little bit funny. Anyway, let's give it a closer look. The first German soldier killed in World War II was a soldier named Hans Werner Pusch. He died as a result of friendly fire during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, marking the start of the conflict. As part of the initial German assault on Poland, German forces were advancing rapidly across the Polish border. They were utilizing a combination of infantry, tanks, and airstrikes in what became known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The Germans had heavily invested in coordination between their ground forces and air force to execute a swift and overwhelming attack. Pusch was killed during a chaotic and fast-moving assault. As German forces advanced, there was confusion on the battlefield, and due to the rapid movement of troops and vehicles, Pusch was accidentally shot by one of his own soldiers. The confusion and lack of clear identification in the heat of battle contributed to this tragic case of friendly fire. Pusch's death illustrates how difficult it can be to maintain clear communication and identification in the chaos of battle. In the early stages of a major offensive, especially one as fast-moving as the Blitzkrieg, confusion is common, and mistakes, such as friendly fire incidents, were more likely to occur. Next one is a story about German U-boat that surrendered months after the war ended. U-977 was a Type VIC U-boat, a class commonly used by the German Navy Kriegsmarine during World War II. It was part of the fleet engaged in the Battle of the Atlantic, tasked with attacking Allied shipping. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, and the war in Europe was effectively over. However, U-977 did not immediately surrender. The U-boat was still on a mission at the time of Germany's surrender and continued its operations, operating under confusion and uncertainty in the final days of the war. U-977's commander, Kapitänleutnant Heinz Schäfer, along with the crew, decided to continue their mission rather than surrender immediately. On May 10, 1945, just 2 days after Germany's surrender, U-977 set sail from its base in Norway, embarking on a secretive journey. The submarine didn't follow the traditional surrender protocol and instead headed south across the Atlantic Ocean to Argentina. The crew had a vague understanding that Nazi sympathizers and remaining German military officers might be found there, and the journey could potentially offer asylum. Some of the crew also hoped to avoid being captured by the Allies, particularly the British or the Soviets. Eventually, U-977 reached Argentina on August 17, 1945, months after the official end of the war. The crew was unaware that the war had ended and, upon arrival in Argentina, they finally surrendered to the Argentine authorities, who were sympathetic to the Nazis at the time. When U-977 arrived in Argentina, the crew was detained by the Argentine Navy, but none of them were treated as prisoners of war in the traditional sense. Instead, they were interned, and many members of the crew were later released or given asylum by the Argentine government. Kapitänleutnant Heinz Schäfer, the commander of U-977, was allowed to stay in Argentina, where he later wrote a memoir about his experiences titled U-Boat 977. He was eventually granted permission to leave Argentina and settle in Germany after several years. Next one is about Soviet anti-tank dog program that really backfired. The Soviet Union trained dogs to run under enemy tanks with bombs strapped to them. However, the dogs often ran back to their own troops, causing unintended explosions. The idea was based on the concept of using dogs trained to carry explosives that would detonate upon contact with enemy tanks, disabling or destroying them. The Soviet Union started this program in the early 1940s, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had limited access to anti-tank weapons, particularly in the early stages of the war. While they had some tank-destroying tools, They faced a severe shortage of effective, long-range anti-tank weapons like bazookas or Panzerfausts. And why the plan backfired. The primary issue with the program was that the dogs didn't always follow orders as expected. Dogs are not inherently inclined to seek out tanks on a battlefield, especially when there is noise, chaos, and gunfire everywhere. When released onto the battlefield, many of the dogs became confused or distracted. Instead of running under the German tanks as they were trained to do, some of them would run toward Soviet tanks instead, resulting in them blowing up their own forces. Many of the dogs were not sufficiently trained to perform the task under the stressful conditions of a battlefield. The program relied on a very specific type of behavior, and battlefield confusion made it nearly impossible for the dogs to follow their training. Some dogs, even after being trained to run under tanks, simply ran away or became too terrified by the battle to act as they had been conditioned to do. Next one is really drastic, so I recommend skipping it if you don't have a strong stomach. Japan used plague bombs on China. During World War II, the Empire of Japan used biological weapons, including plague bombs, against China as part of its brutal and covert warfare tactics. This was carried out by the Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army, a secret biological and chemical warfare research unit. The use of plague bombs was just one part of a larger effort to develop and deploy biological weapons on a horrific scale, targeting civilians and military personnel in China. Japan developed plague bombs that were designed to release these infected fleas into the environment. These bombs were dropped from airplanes or artillery shells and were intended to spread the plague over wide areas. The infected fleas would then bite humans and animals, causing them to contract the bubonic plague, which could lead to rapid death in the infected population. The bombs were primarily dropped in areas such as Chinese cities, countryside, and military camps where Japan sought to create maximum disruption. One of the most notable instances of this biological warfare was the bombing of Ningbo in 1940, where Japan reportedly dropped infected fleas in an effort to spread the plague among the population. The seventh fact that you didn't know before. The US had a plan to drop gay bombs on enemy troops. The idea of the gay bomb was connected to the US military's research into chemical weapons and non-lethal weapons during the World War II. The project reportedly started in 1944 when the US military's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency DARPA explored various chemical warfare options, including the potential use of hormones and pheromones that might alter the behavior of enemy soldiers. The intended purpose was disrupting troop cohesion. The theory was that soldiers would be so distracted by these newfound desires or urges that they would lose focus and be unable to effectively fight or function as a unit. And it also attacked the morale. The thought process was that by inducing homosexual attraction, the soldiers would be disoriented, uncomfortable, and less likely to fight effectively. Why the gay bomb was never used? Lack of scientific credibility. The idea of using pheromones or hormones to alter sexual orientation or behavior was highly speculative, and the science behind it was not grounded in any solid biological or psychological research. No scientific evidence supported the idea that pheromones could induce specific sexual behavior, let alone make people attracted to the same sex. Even if the chemicals worked as intended, there was no certainty that they would achieve the desired outcome. It was unlikely that simply inducing attraction would have disrupted the enemy's ability to fight. People might have reacted in various ways to the chemical agents, and there was no way to predict the consequences. The next one. Hitler's doctor gave him 28 different drugs. Dr. Morell was known for his unconventional and sometimes dangerous treatments, and he prescribed over 28 different types of drugs to Hitler, including a variety of stimulants, sedatives, and other substances. For example, Pervitin, cocaine, morphine, and Eucodol, barbiturates, and testosterone. Dr. Morell was known to have a very unorthodox approach to medicine and was often criticized for his unscientific methods. Some historians argue that he may have been trying to keep Hitler functioning despite his physical and mental decline. Hitler's health steadily worsened over the years, particularly during the war, which was likely worsened by his drug use. The combined effects of stimulants, opiates, and sedatives may have caused severe mental instability, mood swings, and delusions. There are accounts of Hitler becoming more paranoid, disconnected from reality, and even delusional as the war dragged on. Some believe his drug use contributed significantly to his increasingly erratic decision-making, particularly in the final years of the war. The next one is about a US soldier stole the Nazi sword of the Führer. During the capture of Hitler's Eagle's Nest in Berchtesgaden, in Germany, a US soldier named PVT, Harold Halde Green, stole one of the most famous Nazi artifacts, Hitler's personal sword. The sword, also known as the Sword of the Führer, was a ceremonial weapon presented to Hitler by the Nazis in the 1930s. Green reportedly took the sword as a souvenir after the area was secured. He later displayed the weapon in his home, but the story took an unexpected turn when the sword was eventually returned to the US military years later. The stolen sword became a symbol of the bizarre and personal moments that occurred during wartime occupations, and it sparked debates about the ethics of looting artifacts from defeated enemies. And finally, the last one. The 10th fact is about a Japanese soldier that refused to surrender for 29 years after World War II ended. One of the most bizarre stories of stubbornness and loyalty to duty came from a Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda. He was stationed on the Philippine island of Lubang when World War II ended in 1945, but Onoda was unaware of the surrender orders. He continued to fight the war on his own, refusing to believe the war was over. For 29 years, Onoda lived in the jungle, surviving by scavenging and occasionally engaging in guerrilla warfare against local Philippine forces. It wasn't until 1974, when his former commanding officer flew to the island to personally order him to surrender, that he finally gave up and came out of hiding. Onoda's long resistance after the war became a symbol of extreme loyalty, though it also highlighted the brutal impact of propaganda and war on soldiers' minds.
If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. Leave a one interesting fact and comment that no one knows.